I want to share a few words about the scapegoat today because I believe they absolutely need to be said this year. Get comfortable. So this is a time, stretch out, maybe do some rabbi yoga at the same time, get in the right position, and let's explore this concept of the scapegoat. And it's a little bit challenging. Likely the most profound explanation in my experience of the scapegoat comes from the legendary 20th century thinker Renee Girard. Raised in France, but whose academic career later was mostly in America, first at Indiana and then for so long at Stanford. He's actually one of the few quasi-American academics who was immortalized as one of the 40 immortels, the immortals, in the Académie Française. His theory goes like this: all human society is based on the inclusionary force that we all want the same things. And you should want what others want, therefore. Be like us and imitate us. Imitation steers our sexual longings and our Wall Street trends. When an advertisement beckons you to join the glamorous people in the frame by drinking their beverage or driving their car, we are given to believe that there is plenty for all. But then the contrary force, the exclusionary force, follows. Problems arise when scarcity imposes limits, or when envy eyes an object that cannot be shared, or one that the possessor has no wish to share. Capital, an inheritance, privilege, admittance. We want what others want because we believe, he writes, that the other possesses an inner perfection that we do not. We become consumed by the wish to be like others, to be them. We hope that by acquiring their trappings, their cars, their friends, their money, their education, we will acquire their metaphysical goods, authority, wisdom, autonomy, self-fulfillment, and contentedness, which may well be largely imagined anyway. So there's an ironic jealousy of one side to another. One wants the perceived metaphysical possession of the other side. For example, I think the progressives want the perceived unending access to money and education, elite education, going to the front of the line for employment. They want that for everybody, not just for those. And those on the right, I think, actually want something they perceive on the left. A certain kind of love and sympathy and social cohesion and common support. Even a love based on skin color. Even love based on collective consolation in a history of victimization. And so they produce their own tribe, their own ideology of whites as the victims, with a common heritage of American whiteness largely fabricated, ready to love the disaffected person, the disaffected white person, skimming through social media, feeling alone and disaffected. So we live in a crazy dynamic. Social cohesion is based on you wanting what others want, but it's also based on you not being able to get what you want. And so you have to deal with profound disappointment and frustration. And so the nature of society with the two opposing forces, centripetal and centrifugal, they builds and builds and builds, according to Girard. And as it does, as the tension needs to be released, the rhetoric of the society will change. There is a third party to blame. They are responsible. They are the other. Violence against them is, well, it's not something we wish for. But, as people say on the streets outside Beth Israel, it would make logical sense. Maybe it makes more than logical sense. Social cohesion can only be restored, according to Girard, through the blame of something outside the system, and they come together in violence against this thing. After all, challenging oneself would mean questioning why we want what we want at all, and maybe asking whether what it is we want, what we're all striving for in this kind of life of technology and social status, economic and environmental exploitation, whether it's the right thing to be desiring at all, rather than trying to get it for everybody, wondering, is there a different way? What are we willing to give up? It's natural to focus on who is keeping us who is getting what we want, and maybe questioning what kind of life we want is their evil plan to keep us from achieving it when they want to hoard it for themselves. What distinguished Girard and frustrated his critics was his view of Judaism and, in a different way, Christianity. For a late 20th century French theorist who did most of his work in America, one would expect that religion is the culprit here, encouraging people to commit violence against the others to protect the tribe. But since the conundrum of desire and coveting is not caused by religion, it's caused by any social coming together, it's the foundation of every society, religion actually, properly practiced, can be a way of alleviating the violence. He says that by first creating invisible forces that are responsible for our inability to have what others have in equal measure, we can do violence against the invisible, which is a much healthier strategy. We must take arms against the demons, against the evil inclination, as Neil chanted, against the Yetzer Hara, against the Satan, whose shofar blast interrupts. They're the problem. So let's kill the evil inclination. Let's kill the invisible forces, not actual things, not actual people. Much better to have an invisible scapegoat than to attack a human scapegoat. And of course, these solutions are temporarily effective when a society is being pulled apart by false promise and imitation. Real violence against a human scapegoat is almost inevitable to relieve the pressure. And we Jews know what that's like, not just in Nazi Germany and the European countries who eagerly handed over Jews for slaughter, but we know it today. And that's why the scapegoat needs to be lingered with for this moment. We have people, according to a recent NPR story, they get online to Google or to search social media about George Soros. And they're taken to a QAnon conspiracy theory. Maybe it's congressional candidate Marjorie Taylor Greene accusing George Soros and the Rothschild family of being in a cabal of democratic pedophiles, labeling them as enemies of the people. And maybe, as researchers have pointed out, like Gregory Stanton, formerly of George Mason University professor of genocide studies, it's not accidental that the Hollywood cabal is a signal of Jews. Democrats are a signal of Jews. It is the protocols of the elders of Zion dressed up in a different way. The fact that they're all engaged in some secret child sex trafficking ring bears more than a little resemblance to the blood libel accusation. According to a recent study that quoted in USA Today, almost 2/3 of millennials and Generation Zers don't know that 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust, and almost half can't name a single concentration camp. In New York, who ranked among the bottom 10 states in the analysis of Holocaust knowledge, nearly 20% of millennials and Generation Zers incorrectly believe that Jews caused the Holocaust, 20%. The sort of denial and distortion around the causes of the Holocaust is a form of anti-Semitism, said Gretchen Skidmore, the director of education initiatives for the Levine Family Institute for Holocaust Education at the United States Holocaust Museum. The results come amid a rise in anti-Semitic incidents around the US in recent years. The Anti-Defamation League said in May that it had recorded an all-time high of anti-Semitic incidents in 2019 since it began tracking such events in 1979. My first gigs as an adjunct lecturer were in the Cal State University system, where I started out teaching in the Ethnic Studies Department on the Hayward campus just south of Berkeley. To think that but 20 years ago, I was recruited to help teach on immigration history of Jews in America and its connection to other ethnic groups and discrimination cooperatively with lecturers on the oppression of ethnicities in America. And now 20 years later, Governor Newsom signed into law a requirement that all Cal State students take a course in the Ethnic Studies Department, but focusing on Native American, African American, Asian American, and Latina and Latino studies, with, despite protests, Jewish studies left out. And now there's a bill before Governor Newsom making mandatory a high school requirement in California to teach racism in this country. And again, Jewish groups have pointed out that the proposed curricula essentially eliminate discussion of anti-Semitism. Meanwhile, San Francisco State invited Leila Khaled, the famous unrepentant PLO hijacker terrorist who had cosmetic surgery back in the day so she could even hijack a second time without being detected, to speak at their session on, quote, justice, gender, and resistance. Nothing strange about that. The president of the university defended it. Even Zoom and Facebook, not exactly known for great leaders in this area, refused to carry it because it violated their already rather thin terms of service. It was carried by YouTube until they stopped the stream 23 minutes into the talk, as she called for fighting the occupiers by whatever means possible, including weapons. To get YouTube and Facebook to remove something, it's got to be pretty offensive. In the year 2020, it has now become commonplace that to call the Palestinian Arabs of Israel the indigenous people to the land, and that of Jews as colonialist. This has become a practically undisputed norm in some of the circles I run in, despite the fact that Jews have resided in the land for at least 3,000 years. Also new in the contemporary essays I read is the statement that Israel is perpetrating a Palestinian genocide. So I tried to go to the Palestinian groups that say this. They're quoted by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, both highly invested in global condemnation of Israel. So I read their most recent report. According to them, in 2019, both agree, based on Palestinian reporting, that approximately 100 Palestinians were killed by Israeli forces in 2019. Many of those, they write, maybe half, were engaged in attacking Israeli forces or attempting to enter Israel in order to do so. During this time, 1,378 rockets were fired toward Israeli population centers during 2019. One of those killed a Palestinian mother of 9 and her toddler. We are blamed for being the cause of that act because we forced them into it. Human Rights Watch also notes that Hamas authorities held during this time 1,885 Palestinians in detention for crimes ranging from journalism to demonstrating to unnatural intercourse, as gay relationships are punished by a 10-year sentence. To call the deaths of 100 people, which are tragic, and I regret them, and I think we should limit them, if not eliminate them, but to call those attacks a Zionist genocide of the Palestinian people is nothing other than an act of gross scapegoating and of gross anti-Semitism. Even for those of us on the left who consider Israel stained by its racism and its human rights abuses, as the country of the United States is as well, and that those abuses are largely targeted in Israel at people of color, Jewish and not Jewish, Israeli and Arab and Bedouin, we have to wonder whether this is the basis for scapegoating Jews, or whether this is not an earned moniker, but a resurgence of the kind of anti-Semitism Girard was explaining, the kind that sets the stage for eliminating violence against the scapegoat. The Palestinian people are crying out in pain, and we need to hear their cries, and we need to end the abuses against them. They are reprehensible. They are against Torah. But to give sanction to groups who are saying that it's us, that they're saying they're with us, but at the same time promoting our destruction in a time of rampant legitimated anti-Semitism is folly. Racism and anti-Semitism are two sides of the same coin. Racism is the conspiratorial belief that people of color deserve their disadvantage, while anti-Semitism is the conspiratorial belief that Jews have an unfair advantage and therefore are causing others to be deprived, maybe of the metaphysical gifts they see in us. You cannot get rid of one while condoning the other. And we know why. Because the innocent scapegoat has to be the cause of why people aren't getting what they think they deserve, because they think it requires a privilege that another has seized. Anti-Semitism is at its heart the belief that Jews have figured out a way to unjustly hoard privilege for themselves at the cost of others. It's the reason why people say it's a Palestinian genocide. It's the reason people say they're indigenous people to the land. It's the reason we only got there in the late 19th century. So what would a healthier model look like? Well, I have to warn you, it's probably impossible to achieve, according to Girard. But if we had to say, if we could truly reach our potential, what would we do with the anxiety, the frustration, the hatred, and the need to scapegoat? It would be to assemble the entire people, every single one, and to acknowledge that it's not a demon's fault or a scapegoat's fault, that we are not equitably distributing the social goods. We could kill the bankers, we could kill the politicians voted into office by their constituents, we could kill the boogaloos, we can stop the immigrants and the refugees, but somehow that's not going to get rid of my kid not getting into U of M, or my out-of-work son getting a good-paying job in a starter home. And so we assemble the whole people to talk about it and to realize that. And what if this people who got together said that it's not a part of the whole that is to blame, or an outsider who's to blame for inequality, anxiety, and the loosening of the social bonds, but it's we ourselves as an entire collective unit? What if it's the we that all of us are a part of? What if we could say that we are one, and it's our own shortcomings that produce inequality, destruction? And so let's not talk about who is damned and who is saved, but let's say we're all in this together, for that's how God perceives us. And let's do a communal confession. And what if we could say, let's spend 25 hours together, and each of us reflect on whether the motivations that drive us are to be respected? What if maybe, just maybe, what if what we're all chasing is not worth chasing after? What if we could all live with less in a simpler way? Or what if we could find worth in the sight of God through values that aren't about accumulation and social status? What if we could think that it's not other people that have the answer, but the answer is with us in this reflection and process? So what if we could alleviate the pressure that leads to hate and violence by finding some point of equilibrium between rethinking the goals that we're chasing and rethinking our individual and collective role in inequality and dissension and scapegoating itself? And what if after all this, we don't actually kill the scapegoat at all, but we recognize that the scapegoat is innocent all along, and we send it outside the tribe, back to the invisible demon that stays at a distance, and we kind of know is our own fabrication? But wouldn't that be impossible? No religion would ever be smart enough to do that. No tribe would be able to understand that, practice that, and do that. No tribe would take the time to realize that our life is spent participating in a system that needs profound change from within and profound self-therapy, not to find the cause of our problems in one people or one group. If we're going to live in some fantasy land where such psychological, ethical, and social self-knowledge were possible, linked to an actual core spiritual practice of the tribe, then Rabbi, why not just toss in that when they're doing it, they then read some prophetic words reminding them that it's not even the ritual that is effective. It's relieving the social inequities that must be addressed collectively, because it wasn't even the fast that God wanted, nor the sacrifice. Let's throw that in. Let's throw in the prophetic words of the anonymous prophet Isaiah, which will be found starting this today with chapter 48, following the Maftir Aliyah on 282.
Amen. Uveso.